Edmonia Lewis Lost and Found at the National Museum of American Art honors a gifted sculptor whose work was all but forgotten after 1911. It wasn't until the late 1960s that interest in her work was rekindled, and for good reason. She was one of the first to combine the naturalistic element of the neoclassical in a rich pastiche of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian detail.
There has been for many years, I guess, a growing neglect as far as her history was concerned, and finally in the late 1960s, when Black Studies came about, why she emerged from kind of obscurity. When she was alive, she had a brief career of about 10 years, that she was famous both nationally and internationally. And then she retired to Rome, where she had been studying and working, and very little was heard about her. In fact, we don't know when she died or where she died. In that sense, she got lost. She has been rediscovered, just the way her most famous sculpture, The Death of Cleopatra, which was exhibited at the Centennial Exposition in 1876, and then in Chicago. And then more or less had a bumpy history in Chicago, where it was stored and then found in a saloon. Eventually put on a racetrack as a memorial to a horse, and eventually ended up in a yard for discarded objects. Then in the mid-'80s, why a fire inspector found this object and had his Boy Scout troop clean it off. And in so doing, they found that there was a signature, and so it was, in a sense, rediscovered. But it was in very serious shape. It had been vandalized, there was missing parts, there had been graffiti on it, and it looks nothing like it does today, nor anything like it did originally. So it has been found, has been rediscovered, has been repossessed, if you want, and now it's looking pretty good.
To completely restore it would compromise its integrity, wouldn't it?
We could not totally restore it because the weathering of the stone is such that we have lost a lot of the surface. To try and get the original polished surface would in fact be damaging the stone itself, damaging the statue. So we'll never be able to get that. So why don't we in some ways tell people that this piece has a history just as the artist has a history, and that this is part of it. It's a classic case of what can happen to a sculpture if it's not properly taken care of.
She had a brother who helped fund her education at Oberlin College and enabled her to study art. Why would he have not kept in touch with her over the years and tried to provide some form of legacy through the family, at least?
We don't know. But certainly in his obituaries, she comes out as part of his story. When they talk about his life, they also say, and he is the brother of Edmonia Lewis, whom he helped start as an artist. So what the answer there is, we don't know, and that's an area where perhaps in the long run something may come out.
Her father was African American, her mother was Chippewa Indian, and in a way I get the feeling that contributed significantly to her artistic sensibility and to her choice of subject matter in some cases.
Certainly her choice of subject matter, and I think this is where she differs from many of the artists of her time in Rome. Because for her, art was a way of expressing certain ideas that were meaningful to her in her life. And certainly she mentions a number of times that a certain subject or a portrait was done because the individual had been so kind to the people of her father's race. In the case of the Chippewa side, or the why Longfellow, in his Song of Hiawatha, was one of the few Americans at the time who represented American Indians in a sympathetic manner. In an era when a dead Indian was the best Indian, why, this was a refreshing kind of response. And so she felt that, and she saw that he was representing them in a kindly way, in a way that made them human beings and not something wild.
Yes, the old arrow maker is the one you're specifically referring to here.
True. Well, the interesting thing about the old arrow maker is that if you look at it very carefully and you read Longfellow's poem, the details in the statue conform very closely to what he says. The deer, everything. The deer, in fact, is a very small deer. If anyone looking at it in American eyes would say, this is the smallest deer, it must be a fawn. But it is not, because Longfellow says in the poem, he threw a roebuck down. A roebuck is a European deer. It's a very small European deer, which Edmonia Lewis could have seen in Rome and in some of the gardens around that particular city.
You had indicated she became internationally known as a sculptor. She had a certain naturalistic style that was unique. Is that true?
The thing about her works is that they tend to be rather detailed. But if you take a subject such as Hagar, most people would say it looks like a typical neoclassical sculpture in that it is white marble. It tends to have a pose that looks rather lyrical, and it has that kind of literary aspect to it. But generally speaking, neoclassical sculptures tended to get away from the emotions, and to some degree, Hagar is shown with furrowed brow. Now, a furrowed brow is not something that most neoclassical sculptures would show. They would tend to find people meditating as opposed to furrowing.
Was it her way of symbolizing all women, perhaps, a symbolic struggle here?
Not only Hagar, but Cleopatra. She always said that she had a particular feeling for all women who had suffered. And this is true because certainly she herself had overcome enormous obstacles.
Not just struggling from a woman's point of view, but also the mixed heritage. Hagar had mixed heritage, and of course so did Edmonia.
True, and there are a certain number of similarities that you could make. And the same thing for Cleopatra too.
Her death of Cleopatra was somewhat of a different depiction than others had depicted this incredible queen. Is that true?
The idea of showing someone who is dead or dying is, I think in 19th century vocabulary, a kind of a gruesome idea. But for her, it was a representation of the queen going out in grand style, one who would not be subjugated to the whim of Octavian, the Roman ruler, who would not be paraded before the Roman public as a slave. And in a sense, she goes out as a queen, one who has done a great deal, who has survived against a number of odds in a man's world, much the way Edmonia Lewis herself made a choice to be a sculptor, to persevere when people told her not to, or that she couldn't. Edmonia admired her, and so in showing her in her regal self, having made a choice, that she is saying something about the strength of that woman, Cleopatra.
Would Moses be an example of a commissioned work?
Moses, by Edmonia Lewis, is a small reduction after the Michelangelo original that's in the church in Rome. And for many American artists, the making of copies of past masterpieces or historical pieces that had particular importance to people was a common thing. It was a way of making an income. Presumably, what they might have done is model something in clay, of which they would make a plastered model. And they would have this in their studio. When the time came and somebody came to their studio, they would say, "Oh, I like that. Could I have that in marble?" You very often didn't put things in marble because it was costly, so you waited for somebody to ask you to put it in marble. It saved a lot of money.
She apparently had a sense of humor and did some lighter pieces like Poor Cupid, Love Ensnared.
Poor Cupid is an interesting piece. One might say this is a piece that is a fancy piece. It's a little conceit or a genre piece, which was to attract people to a subject that was kind of lighthearted. Here's Cupid, who has bent over to pick up a wonderful rose and has set off the trap that has ensnared him, suggesting that love is not forbidden even to Cupid, and Cupid can be ensnared. Oddly enough, it's done probably around 1873 when an article in a San Francisco paper rumored that Edmonia Lewis was engaged. Well, as far as we know, she never married. But maybe she was expressing a certain heartfelt feeling on her part that she had been trapped. Who knows? Probably not, but it's an interesting speculation.
Some 60 works, and how many can we actually account for?
Well, Marilyn Richardson, I think, feels that there probably is at least 40 that she can account for. How much more than that, I'm not sure. But from my knowledge, it tends to be the religious works. Things that were meant for churches, that were commissioned for a religious setting. Those are the things that have not been found, to my knowledge.
And you feel they could conceivably be in churches or in some kind of religious settings?
True. They could be in churches, they could be in private chapels. She did find a certain amount of patronage from English sources. And if that is the case, it is possible that in country houses where there were chapels or in small chapels in other churches around the countryside that were more of a private nature, things might show up. It's hard to know.